Welcome Life Sciences learners to the next segment of our lesson. We've been looking at food chains, we've been looking at energy flow in an ecosystem. In this segment, we're going to focus on ecological pyramids. So what are ecological pyramids? What do these represent? What are the different types? So let's get into the lesson and we'll unpack all of these questions. When we look at ecological pyramids, it's important that we understand what do they represent. An ecological pyramid represents a relative amount of organisms at the different trophic levels in an ecosystem. So they could show the number of organisms at a different trophic level. There are three main types of ecological pyramids. Ones that show the number of individuals at different levels, the other that shows the biomass or the amount of energy available, and the other shows you, as I mentioned, the amount of energy. So we'll have to look at these three separately and look at these representations to understand what each one represents. So why are ecological pyramids shaped as a pyramid? So essentially, why is it that we have this pyramid shape in an ecosystem? Again, if we apply the understanding that there is energy that constantly decreases, and if we use the concept that energy is decreasing from one trophic level to the next, it does make sense. Because it means that as we move further up, the amount of energy available at each trophic level significantly decreases. And hence we have this pyramid shape. So as I mentioned, when the food passes from the primary producers to the secondary consumers and then to the tertiary consumers, much of the energy is lost during the process, and we've looked at the different processes. So let's look at the pyramid of numbers. Essentially, the pyramid of numbers is a representation of the number of individuals at each trophic level. Let's try and recognize what that means. So as I mentioned, it's the relative number of individuals at each trophic level in a food chain. These are usually shaped like a pyramid, as their higher number of trophic level individuals cannot be sustained if there are more predators than prey. So essentially what it means is that in any ecological pyramid that shows you the number of individuals, there is often the largest number would be the producers, which would form a broad base, followed by a significantly fewer number of consumers or tertiary consumers. And that's essentially because in any food chain or in any ecosystem, in order for that to establish what we refer to as a balance, we need to have a large base of producers and generally fewer consumers as we move up. If not, we will find that that becomes an unsustainable habitat or ecosystem. So a pyramid of numbers generally, as I mentioned, is an indication of the number of individuals that are present at each trophic level. And we know that in terms of sustaining the energy needs, we'll find that the number of individuals tend to decrease at each trophic level. However, guys, it's important that we recognize that the shape may be distorted in a food if the food source is disproportionately large in size, or if the biomass is different as we compare them to the feeder. So here is an example of a disproportionate number pyramid. So here we're seeing a tree that has a large number of aphids that feed on it. So if we were to count the number of aphids, these are really very small invertebrates that feed on the cells, the sap on the tree. These in turn are food for lacewing. And these feed on the aphids, which are significantly fewer in number. And then we obviously have birds that feed on these. So we're seeing that this is a disproportionate number pyramid. And that's essentially because of the number of producers being a single tree. As I mentioned, there's another example where a large number of caterpillars may feed on a single oak tree, which in turn may have fleas that in turn feed off a single dog on a host. So again, we find that dogs could be a single host that have many fleas that feed on them. In turn, that becomes a disproportionate pyramid. We also have pyramids that are inverted. As I mentioned, if we're counting the number of individuals, in this case, a single tree provides a habitat and food for different herbivores, birds. In turn, these birds have a number of parasites that live on them. And these parasites in turn have parasites that live on them. So we're seeing that there is a decrease or there's an increase in the number of individuals, not necessarily the amount of energy. So an inverted pyramid number is found in parasitic food chains. Again, in these food chains, there is normally one producer supporting a number of different parasites or individuals that feed off each other. As I mentioned here, these herbivores are a source of food to the parasites, and in turn we have parasites that feed off these parasites and refer to them as your hyperparasites. A pyramid of biomass in turn is another representation that we look at in terms of ecological pyramids. A pyramid of biomass shows you the total mass of organisms at each stage of a food chain. Here we're seeing that if we were to count or measure the amount of mass that is present or energy available from your producers, let's assume that we've measured this as 1,000 kilograms. The amount of herbivores that feed off that have significantly decreased, and the mass of that could be 100 kilograms. And we see this gradually decreasing as we move from the first trophic level to your third and fourth trophic levels respectively. These pyramids are almost always upright in shape. As they increase in biomass, decreases gradually as we move up the food chain. Again, another illustration that shows you how the amount of energy again decreases as we move up from one trophic level to the next. A pyramid of energy also is always an upright pyramid. As I mentioned, the rule of a decrease in energy and the amount of energy available, you can see that again in this pyramid there's 100% of the energy that is consumed by the producers, in this case your autotrophs being grass, and only 10% of that being available to the primary consumers, and your secondary consumers in turn get only 1%. So we find that the pyramids of energy will never appear inverted, as some of the energy is stored in one source and is always lost upon transfer from one trophic level to the next. So guys, as I mentioned, when we look at the energy pyramid, it's important that we understand that each level should be roughly 1/10 of the size of the preceding level. That essentially means that the energy transformation has decreased approximately about 90%, meaning that only 10% of energy is available. What we recognize is that much of the energy is utilized by the organisms at each level for metabolic functioning, such as respiration, maintenance of the body, repair of tissue, growth, and reproduction. And this is crucial to every organism's existence, is that much of the energy is important in them surviving. We often see that in your larger predators, that they have got to conserve the energy. So when a predator is on a hunt, he needs to ensure that that hunt is successful, because in being able to carry out the hunt or catch a prey, it needs to be able to use just enough energy so that it can sustain itself. And so the reason being is that the energy available from the prey that they consume is going to replenish the energy, and hence we see that that energy is constantly needing to be upgraded as they consume food. So energy is lost through metabolic waste, as well as I mentioned, through heat, through respiration, as well as through undigested waste products. What's important is that the bottom level will always represent the producers, with the subsequent levels representing consumers, primary, secondary, tertiary, etc. And as I mentioned that, if we look at this illustration here, it shows you a pyramid of energy where we've kind of allocated some numbers to this. So if we assume that energy is produced by the autotrophs, and in this case I've allocated an amount of 1 million joules. And so this is, again, joules is the amount of energy or the unit that we measure energy with. So if the producers are being able to produce 10,000 of those joules from the sun, which is a primary source of energy, the consumers that feed off these are going to access only 10% of that. And so the next trophic level in turn gets 1,000 joules. In turn, that decreases by 90%, and so only 100 joules are available to the next level, the secondary consumers. And finally, our tertiary consumers have only 10 joules of that energy that was initially accessed by the autotrophs. So what we see is a drastic decrease in the amount of energy. As we recognize this, we're seeing that in any energy pyramid, it would take on that broad base that we see here and the narrow apex. And that's again the energy being transferred from one trophic level to the next. Again, as I mentioned, energy pyramids will always have a broad base and a narrow apex. The next concept we look at is bioaccumulation. And as we wrap this section up, we need to understand what bioaccumulation is. We know that in a food chain, energy is passed on from one trophic level to the next. So we find that there's an accumulation of energy as we move up, or there's an accumulation of energy to the uppermost consumers. So this we can refer to as bioaccumulation. Essentially, it points to the increase of a substance in a particular organism is called bioaccumulation. Often this is a measure of pollutants in an ecosystem. Because energy is transferred from one level to the next, we find that pollutants tend to accumulate in an organism as they consume them. So that process of building up or accumulating the toxins in a food chain is called bioaccumulation. We see that this increase in the concentration of substance at a particular trophic level is called biomagnification. So the magnification refers to how the toxin builds up in a food chain, becoming significantly larger. So it's important that we recognize that along with energy moving in an environment which is present with toxins or pollutants, that these pollutants tend to accumulate in the food chains as we move up from one level to the next. So bioaccumulation refers to how pollutants enter the food chain, where they undergo biomagnification and they build up at a specific trophic level. Cool. So because pollutants become concentrated, we refer to that as biomagnification. And as we move up to the higher trophic levels, we see that individuals, which are your tertiary and tertiary consumers, tend to have significantly higher levels of these toxins. An example of this is the pesticide DDT. And this causes the eggshells to thin, and populations tend to decline in species of birds that consume these eggshells where insects have consumed them. So you find that another example of this is the heavy metal mercury. This is released into the waterways via industrial processes and may become concentrated in fish. And we'll see this in the next slide. So you'll find that individuals that consume these will then have a larger concentration building up. So we're seeing that here the mayfly that are present in these water bodies end up being consumed by the bluegill fish, and we see that this is an increase in the concentration of the pollutant, and further up we see that becoming significantly higher in concentration. So this concept of bioaccumulation essentially refers to how a pollutant is transferred from one level to the next, becoming significantly concentrated as we move higher up in the food chain. Well guys, that's a wrap for this segment. Trust that you guys have enjoyed the lesson. We've spent some time looking at various different concepts today, from energy flow, food chains, as well as the different pyramids. You've been a fantastic audience. Wish you well, stay well, go safe, have a bio-lekker day. Cheers.